Hi guys, Miss Main here with today's story. This is a nonfiction book, which means it's full of true facts. We've talked a little bit nonfiction about Thomas Edison. We've talked about the food chain and the food web. Those were all nonfiction books. This is one of my favorite people to know about, read about, learn about. Her name was Helen Keller and her teacher's name was Anne Sullivan. It's a really, really good book. The quiz number is behind me, 14669, and it is a 2.5. It's a little bit of a longer book. It does have chapters, but the chapters are only like 1 or 2 pages. They're very, very quick chapters. But you are going to want to listen to my story 2 or 3 times before you take a quiz. There's a lot of really good information about Helen Keller. The summer was hot. The year was 1880. Way down south in a little town in Alabama, a healthy baby girl was born. Her parents loved her dearly. Her name was Helen Keller. Then the baby became ill. She was not yet 2 years old. Day after day her fever was high. The servants tried to help. Her parents tried to help. The doctor shook his head. There is nothing more we can do, he said. The baby may not live. Helen lived, but she was not the same after the illness. Something is very wrong, her mother said. At last they found out the truth. The child was deaf and blind, which means she cannot hear and she cannot see. The baby grew into a little girl. Her parents felt sorry for her. Helen often cried and held on to her mother. Give the poor child what she wants, her father would say. Helen was deaf and blind, but she was bright too. She copied everyone. Sometimes she made herself look like her father. She put on his glasses. She held up his newspaper. Some people did not think Helen could learn. Her mother did not agree. Helen is very smart, she said, but how can we teach her? She is locked up inside of herself. Chapter 2. Helen began to grow wild. She would not let anyone comb her hair. Her clothes were always filthy. Helen often became angry. Sometimes she lay on the floor and kicked her feet. Throwing a proper temper tantrum. Then a babysitter was born. Let me try that again. A baby sister was born, not a babysitter. Baby sister was born. Helen was not happy. My poor Helen, said her mother. Now there is always a baby in my lap. One day Helen pushed the baby out of the cradle onto the floor. No, Helen, her mother cried. What will we do? We must find help. The Kellers went to Washington, D.C. to visit the famous Alexander Graham Bell. Maybe he could help Helen. Dr. Bell had invented the telephone. He was also a teacher of the deaf. Helen can learn, said Dr. Bell, but she will need a special teacher. Write to the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, Massachusetts, and then ask them to send a teacher. Helen's father wrote to the school. Soon he had an answer. Thank goodness, he said. The Perkins School will send a teacher. On the afternoon of March 3rd, 1887, the teacher arrived. Helen was standing near the front door of the house. Suddenly, she felt footsteps on the stairs. She thought it was her mother and reached out. Remember, she can't see the teacher. She can't hear the teacher. Someone took Helen's hand and pulled her close. It was not Helen's mother, so the girl pulled away. It was Anne Sullivan, her teacher. She was the young woman from Boston who had come to show Helen the world. And she was the woman who had come to love her. Later in her life, Helen would call this day the birthday of her soul. On the day that she arrived, Mrs. Sullivan gave Helen a doll. D-O-L-L, said Miss Sullivan. She spelled the words with her fingers into Helen's hand. She made the letters with a special alphabet. It was the alphabet of hand signs. Helen copied her teacher and spelled D-O-L-L, but she did not understand what she was doing. Soon Miss Sullivan found out that Helen did just what she wanted. At dinner, Helen would not sit in a chair. She walked around the table. She ate from everyone's plate, and she ate with her fingers. You are not being kind to Helen, Mrs. Sullivan told the family. She must be taught how to behave. There were terrible fights. Helen, you will do it my way, Mrs. Sullivan shouted, even though Helen could not hear her. She made Helen sit in a chair. Helen stood up again. She made Helen hold a spoon. Helen threw the spoon away. She made Helen eat from her own plate, and Helen threw the plate across the room. Every meal was a fight, but Miss Sullivan began to win. Helen sat in a chair at last. Helen's mother worried about Helen. Miss Anne, you are too hard on her, said Miss Keller. Miss Sullivan was firm. I cannot teach Helen unless I can control her. Miss Sullivan spoke to Mr. Keller. I must be alone with Helen for a while, she said. May we move into the little house in the garden? For 2 weeks, said Miss Keller. No more. The Kellers took Helen for a long ride, and then they took her to a little house in the garden. That way, Helen did not know she was close to home. Oh, that was smart. She thinks that she's far away. They went for a far ride, but then kind of came right back, close to home. Chapter 4. Miss Sullivan was strict, but kind. Helen began to like her. In the little house, Miss Sullivan spelled words for Helen day and night. B-E-A-D-S, beads. D-O-G, dog. F-U-R, fur. Helen spelled the words back to her teacher, but she still did not understand what she was doing. Helen, the words mean something, said Miss Sullivan. So she was begging Helen to understand. So there's the beads, there's the dog, there's the fur. She's beginning to understand. The 2 weeks were up. Helen and Miss Sullivan moved back into the big house. Helen still did not understand her hand signs, but her teacher did not give up. One day, she was teaching the words water and mug, water and mug. Again and again. We need a rest, said Miss Sullivan. We will take a walk outside. The day was warm and sunny. Helen and her teacher walked in the garden. They came to a water pump. Miss Sullivan had an idea. The teacher began pumping. Water poured out. Miss Sullivan put Helen's hand into the water and then she spelled water. Water, Helen, water. Suddenly, Helen understood. She understood that water meant the wet something running over her hand. She understood the word water was a word. She understood that words were the most important thing in the world. Words would tell her everything that she wanted to know. My heart began to sing. She later wrote, it was as if I had come back to life after being dead. Even though she's not really ever been dead, but just comes to life. Suddenly, Helen wanted to know the names of everything. Ground, ground. Flower, flower. And then she pointed to Miss Sullivan. Miss Sullivan spelled out Teacher, teacher. Miss Sullivan knew now that Helen understood. She was filled with joy. I thought my heart would burst, she wrote. Miss Sullivan ran to the house with Helen. She told everyone what had happened. Helen's mother wept with joy. My darling child, she cried. And then Miss Keller turned to Helen's teacher. Miss Annie, what you have done is a miracle. It was true. The miracle did happen that day, but it was not the last one. The life of Helen Keller was filled with miracles for years to come. So Helen Keller was born in 1880 to 1968. In the years that followed, Helen learned to read and write. She even learned to speak. She went to school. She graduated from Radcliffe College with honors. Anne Sullivan helped Helen all through school. They stayed together almost 50 years. They stayed together until the teacher died. So that's the story of Helen Keller. In her life, Helen wrote 5 books. Can you believe that? Blind and deaf, and she could still write books. She traveled many places. She met kings and presidents. She spoke to groups of people around the world. Most of the work that she did was to help people who were blind or deaf. She was a warm and caring person. People loved her in return. The life of Helen Keller brought hope to many. So I hope you enjoyed that story, Helen Keller. Listen to it, please. Please, please, please listen to it 2 times at least before you try to take the quiz, okay? Good job, guys. See you